All right, today we're jumping back in time to the Norman world. Think knights, conquest, massive change. But we're not going to tell just one story. No, we're going to explore it through the clashing voices of three totally different historical documents.
So that brings up a pretty big question, right? How do we really understand the past? I mean, when we look back at a time like the Middle Ages, which is just filled with myths and legends, how do we get to what actually happened? How do we hear the real people?
Well, here's the thing. There isn't just one single story. Maybe the best way to really get a feel for an era is to listen to its contradictions, to hear all the very different, sometimes conflicting, stories it told about itself.
So here's how we're going to tackle this. We're going to look at one world, but through three really different voices. The voice of the knight, the voice of the conquered, and the voice of the law. And then at the end, we'll pull it all together and see what we can learn.
And our three sources, man, they could not be more different. We've got a heroic poem that's all about ideals, then a pretty sober historical chronicle that's full of tragedy, and finally, a dry legal document that, believe it or not, sparked a revolution. Put them together, and you get this amazing 360-degree view of the Norman age.
Okay, first up, let's listen to the voice of the ideal, the voice of the knight. And this comes to us from France's oldest epic poem, the Song of Roland. It's all about one big idea that pretty much defined the whole era: chivalry.
So, what exactly was chivalry? Well, you can think of it as the ultimate code of conduct for a knight. It wasn't just about being a tough guy in a fight. It was about loyalty to your lord, protecting the weak, and, this is key, a really deep devotion to the Christian faith. It was basically the blueprint for the perfect medieval warrior.
You know, what's fascinating about this poem is that it takes a real, pretty minor historical skirmish from way back in the 8th century and just blows it up into this legendary clash between Christian heroes and their enemies. It was written right around the time of the First Crusade, so you can kind of see it as brilliant propaganda for the whole idea of the crusading knight.
And this brings us right to the heart of the poem, the central crisis. Our hero, Roland, he's ambushed, totally outnumbered. His friend is begging him, "Blow your horn, get reinforcements." But Roland refuses. Why? Because, as he says, asking for help would bring shame upon my kindred. He would literally rather die than face what he sees as dishonor.
And this really gets to the core of that whole chivalric code. Is this extreme sense of honor a virtue, something to admire? Or is it a tragic flaw that gets all his men killed for no good reason? The poem doesn't leave you guessing. It absolutely wants you to see it as heroic.
Because in the end, Roland's death isn't seen as a failure at all. He dies a martyr. I mean, look at this. Angels literally come down from heaven to carry his soul to paradise. His death is framed as the ultimate Christian sacrifice. So, that's the ideal. That's the voice of the knight.
Okay, so we've just seen the soaring ideal of the poem. Now we're going to pivot to the harsh reality of conquest. Our second voice is a historian, William of Malmesbury, and he's telling the story from the perspective of the conquered Anglo-Saxons after the Norman invasion in 1066.
What makes William such a fascinating source is his own background. He was half Norman and half English, writing almost a century after the invasion, so he had this really unique insider-outsider perspective. He wasn't just there to celebrate the winners, you can tell he really felt the loss of the losers.
And you can really hear the pain of that displacement in his words. England has become the residence of foreigners and the property of aliens. I mean, imagine that. For the English, their country just wasn't theirs anymore. Suddenly, all the powerful people were Normans. It was a complete cultural takeover.
Now this is really interesting. In his account of the Battle of Hastings, William draws the super sharp contrast. He says the English spent the night before the battle just drinking and singing. The Normans, on the other hand, they spent the whole night in confessing their sins. Now, the key point here is this might not be a literal, factual account, but what it shows us is that medieval Christian ideal of the holy warrior, the guy who prepares his soul for battle. It's the exact same ideal we saw in the Song of Roland, but now it's being used to explain a real-world victory.
All right, our third and final voice is a total shift. It's not about honor or loss, it's about power and its limits. This is the voice of the law, and it comes to us through one of the most famous documents in all of history, the Magna Carta.
So, how did we even get here? Well, King John's rule was, to put it mildly, a disaster. He lost his territories in France, so he started hitting people with these crushing taxes to fund his wars. He was basically ruling like a tyrant. By 1215, his barons, they'd just had enough. They rebelled, they captured London, and they forced him to the negotiating table.
The document they made him sign was the Magna Carta, and it had 63 different clauses. Now, most of them were really specific complaints about feudal rights and taxes, stuff that's pretty obscure today. But hidden inside that long list were two little clauses that would absolutely change the world.
This is the big one, Clause 39. For the very first time, it's written down that a ruler can't just throw you in jail or take your stuff whenever he feels like it. There has to be a legal process, what we today would call due process. This is the bedrock of individual liberty right here.
And Clause 40 is just as powerful. It establishes the idea that justice is a right. It's not something you can buy, and it's not something the powerful can just decide to deny you. It belongs to everyone.
Now look, in 1215, this only applied to free men, who were a pretty small minority. But the principle, the idea it established, was revolutionary. For the first time, it was officially declared in writing that nobody, not even the king, is above the law. His power had limits.
So we've heard from the poet, the historian, and the lawyer. What happens when we put these three totally different voices together? What does it teach us about the Norman world and maybe about history itself?
This table really lays it all out pretty clearly. The Song of Roland gives us that ideal perspective, a world of pure honor and sacrifice. Then William of Malmesbury shows us the cost of that world, the displacement and the loss. And finally, the Magna Carta represents the limit, that demand for justice and rights when power gets out of control.
I think the real takeaway here is that history is never just one thing. These three perspectives, the ideal, the cost, and the limit, they don't cancel each other out. They all existed at the same time. The Norman world was a place of incredible chivalric ideals and brutal conquest and the birth of legal rights all at once.
And that kind of leaves us with one final thought. Every era has its own epic poems, its own stories of loss, and its own demands for justice, right? Even if they don't look exactly the same as these. So it makes you wonder, hundreds of years from now, when people look back at our time, which of our voices will be the ones that echo in the future?